For months, she kept quiet, enduring every cruel act, swallowing her pain. But when he finally crossed the line, when enough was enough, her father, the town's new police chief, ensured that justice wasn't just a word, but a reality. The lunchroom at West Ridge Middle School wasn't your typical battleground. There were no fists flying, no trays being flung in chaotic food fights. No, this war was fought in silence, with glances sharp enough to cut and whispers that carried more weight than any shove ever could. It was a place where a single look determined everything: who fit in, who didn't, who mattered, and who was invisible. 13-year-old Ava Sinclair sat at the farthest end of the cafeteria, her fingers absent-mindedly picking at the edges of her peanut butter sandwich. She focused on it as if it were the most interesting thing in the world, pretending not to hear the voices drifting over from 2 tables away. "Why does she always sit by herself?" someone muttered. "Maybe she doesn't have any friends." Ava had heard it all before. This wasn't new. The feeling of being an outsider was as familiar to her as breathing. Being one of the few Black students at West Ridge, she had learned early on that blending in wasn't an option. Instead, she mastered the art of being unseen, moving through the hallways like a shadow, keeping to herself.
It was easier that way.
Safer. But not for Connor Tate. Connor had made it his personal mission to remind Ava exactly where she stood. He wasn't just any kid, he was the kind of boy who walked the halls like he owned them. Son of a wealthy local businessman, surrounded by all the right people, teachers who smiled when they said his name, parents who welcomed him to their homes, trusting him without a second thought. He had a face that could talk its way out of trouble and a reputation that made sure he never had to. And for the past month, he had decided that Ava was his favorite target. It started small. A shove here, a misplaced elbow there, books mysteriously knocked from her desk. The kind of things no one would label as bullying, just kids being kids, right? But it never stopped there. It never did. Today, it was her lunch. Ava had barely taken a single bite when, out of nowhere, a hand swiped her paper bag off the table. Her stomach dropped. She already knew who it was before she even looked up. There he stood.
Connor. Grinning.
Like this was just another game. "What do we have here, Sinclair?" he taunted, tearing the bag open with exaggerated enthusiasm. He pulled out her sandwich, holding it up like it was something rotten. "Peanut butter? Seriously? Guess your dad's new job doesn't pay enough for real food." Laughter rippled through the table behind him. Ava's fingers curled into a fist under the table. Her jaw tightened. But she said nothing. She always said nothing. Connor leaned in closer, lowering his voice just enough for only her to hear. You should really say thank you. I'm just helping you diet." Then, as if it meant nothing, he tossed the sandwich over his shoulder. Ava barely had time to react before it landed with a sickening splat on the cafeteria floor. Her stomach twisted. Her throat burned. But she wasn't going to cry. Not here. Not in front of them. Slowly, she reached down, hands shaking as she moved to grab what was left of her lunch. But before her fingers could touch it, a foot came down. Hard. A sickening crunch. Peanut butter smeared against the tile. Connor smirked. Oops. For a moment, everything else disappeared. The voices. The noise. The walls of the cafeteria.
It was just Ava.
The ruined sandwich. And their laughter echoing in her ears. She could feel their eyes on her, watching, waiting, expecting her to react. But she already knew what she would do. The same thing she always did. She grabbed her backpack, stood up, and walked away. Past the tables, past the staring faces, past the whispers and the quiet snickers that followed her. She pushed through the cafeteria doors, past the lockers, not stopping until she reached the girls' bathroom. Locking the stall behind her, she sat down on the closed toilet lid and took a slow, shaky breath. This wasn't new. She had been through this before. She would wait until the lunch bell rang, then slip back into the hallways as if nothing had happened. Because telling someone never worked. Teachers would say to ignore it. The principal would brush it off as a misunderstanding. And then, tomorrow, it would start all over again. Except Ava didn't know that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, she wouldn't just walk away. Tomorrow, she would fight back. And tomorrow, Connor would take things further than he ever had before. But for now, all she could do was wait. Ava barely spoke when she got home that afternoon. She moved through the house like a ghost, heading straight to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She never slammed things. She knew how to disappear, even in her own home. But her father noticed.
Ava.
His deep voice carried through the door. Everything okay? She hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack before she let it fall onto the bed.
Yeah.
Just tired. There was a pause. Then a quiet sigh. All right. Dinner's in an hour. She waited until his footsteps faded before exhaling. He had enough to deal with. A new town, a new job, stepping into the chief's office and trying to clean up the mess left behind by the last guy. The last thing he needed was to hear about middle school drama. She could handle it. Except, the next day, Connor made sure she couldn't ignore him. It started before first period. And this time, there was no walking away. Phone screen lit up with dozens of notifications. Her stomach clenched as she tapped on one. Then another. And another. Her breath hitched. Photos. Of her. Not just any photos, edited ones.
Fake.
Twisted. Humiliating. Someone, Connor, it had to be him, had taken pictures of her face and pasted them onto images that weren't hers. Some were just embarrassing, but others were worse. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled. Laughter filled the room, whispers turning into open snickers, students nudging each other as they stared at their screens. Oh my God, she actually saw them. Bet she's gonna cry. Damn, Connor really went all out this time. Ava's throat went dry. The walls of the classroom felt like they were closing in. She shoved her phone back into her bag and forced herself to keep her head down. If she didn't react, maybe it would die down. Maybe by tomorrow, they'd move on to something else. But deep down, she knew better. This wasn't just a joke anymore. This was a public execution. And Connor wanted her to break. That night, Ava sat in bed, her phone face down on her nightstand, screen lighting up with notifications she refused to check. She could hear her dad moving around downstairs, the low murmur of the TV, the clinking of dishes in the sink. Normal sounds. Sounds that should have made her feel safe. But she didn't feel safe. Her hands clenched into fists in her lap. For months, she had let this happen. Ignored it. Walked away. She told herself it didn't matter. That keeping quiet was easier. That it would stop eventually. But it hadn't. And now, Connor had made sure she could never walk into school without hearing his voice in the whispers. Without seeing his face in every smirk aimed her way. She couldn't walk away this time. She wouldn't. Because tomorrow, everything was going to change. Tomorrow, he was going to learn what it felt like to be powerless. And tomorrow, for the first time in her life, Ava Sinclair wasn't going to be silent.